Good morning, Team Alabama. Please open your Chromebooks and turn to Hatchet. And we are on page 5. Our camera froze earlier on page 5. So we're going to go to the second paragraph on page 5. Now you can turn. Bring her back to the left a little. Brian turned the wheel left and pushed on the left pedal, and the plane came back around. It's easy, he smiled. At least this part. The pilot nodded. All of flying is easy. Just takes learning, like everything else, He took the controls back and then reached up and rubbed his left shoulder. Aches and pains. Must be getting old. Brian let go of the controls and moved his feet away from the pedals as the pilot put his hands on the wheel. Thank you. But the pilot had put his headset back on, and the gratitude was lost in the engine noise, and things went back to Brian looking out the window at the ocean of trees and lakes. The burning eyes did not come back, but memories did and came flooding in. The words, always the words: divorce, the secret, fights, split, the big split. Brian's father did not understand as Brian did. Okay, maybe you could add some questions here. What was the secret? What did Brian's dad not know? Brian did. He knew only that Brian's mother wanted to break the marriage apart. The split had come, and then the divorce. All so fast. And the court had left him with his mother, except for the summers and what the judge called visitation rights. So formal. Brian hated judges, as he hated lawyers. Judges that leaned over the bench and asked Brian if he understood where he was to live and why. Judges with the caring look that meant nothing, as lawyers said legal phrases that meant nothing. In the summer, Brian would live with his father, and in the school year with his mother. That's what the judge said, after looking at papers on his desk and listening to the lawyers talk. Words. Now the plane lurched slightly to the right, and Brian looked at the pilot. He was rubbing his shoulder again, and there was a sudden smell of body gas in the plane. Brian turned back to avoid embarrassing the pilot, who was obviously in some discomfort. Must have stomach troubles. So this summer, his first summer, when he was allowed to have visitation rights with his father, with the divorce only 1 month old, Brian was heading north. His father was a mechanical engineer who had designed or invented a new drill bit for oil drilling, a self-cleaning, self-sharpening bit. He was working in the oil fields of Canada, up on the tree line where the tundra started and the forest ended. Brian was riding up from New York with some drilling equipment. Okay, stop there. Let's go ahead and add some facts. Where's Brian headed? Okay, so Brian is heading to see his dad for visitation rights, and he's going to see his dad in Canada. Dad is an engineer, a mechanical engineer. Okay, Brian hates judges. Those are all facts that we can add. Make sure you've got your Google Doc going with your 50 facts. Okay, top of page 7. It was lashed down in the rear of the plane next to the fabric bag the pilot had called a survival pack, which had emergency supplies in case they had to make an emergency landing. That had to be specially made in the city, riding in the bush plane with a pilot named Jim or Jake or something, who had turned out to be an all right guy, letting him fly and all, except for the smell. Now there was a constant odor, and Brian took another look at the pilot and found him rubbing the shoulder and down the arm now, that left arm, letting go more gas and wincing. Probably something he ate, Brian thought. His mother had driven him from the city to meet the plane at Hampton, where it came to pick up the drilling equipment. A drive in silence, a long drive in silence, 2.5 hours of sitting in the car, staring out the window of the plane. Once, after an hour, when they were out of the city, she turned to him. Look, can't we talk this over? Can't we talk this out? Can't you tell me what's bothering you? And there were the words again. Divorce, split, the secret. How could he tell her what he knew? So he had remained silent and shook his head, and continued to stare unseeing at the countryside, and his mother had gone back to driving, only to speak to him one more time when they were close to Hampton. Top of page 8. She reached over the back of the seat and brought up a paper sack. I got something for you for the trip. Brian took the sack and opened the top, and inside there was a hatchet, the kind with a steel handle and a rubber hand grip. The head was in a stout leather case that had a brass riveted belt loop. It goes on your belt. His mother spoke now without looking at him, and there was some farm trucks on the road now, and she had to weave through them and watch traffic. The man at the store said that you could use it, you know, in the woods with your father. Dad thought, not my father, my dad. Thanks, it's really nice. But the words sounded hollow, even to Brian. Try it on, see how it looks on your belt. And he would normally have said no, would normally have said no, that it looked too hokey to have a hatchet on your belt. Those were the normal things he would say, but her voice was thin, and had a sound like something thin that would break if you touched it, and he felt bad for not speaking to her. Knowing what he knew, even with the anger and the white-hot hate of his anger at her, he still felt bad for not speaking to her, and so to humor her, he loosened his belt and pulled the right side out and put the hatchet on and rethreaded the belt. Scooch around so I can see. He moved around in the seat, feeling only slightly ridiculous. She nodded, just like a scout, my little scout. And there was the tenderness in her voice that she had when he was small, the tenderness that she had when he was small and sick and cold. And she put her hand on his forehead, and the burning came into her eyes again, and he had turned away from her and looked out the window, forgetting the hatchet on his belt, and so arrived at the plane with the hatchet still on his belt. Because it was a bush flight from a small airport, there had been no security, and the plane had been waiting with the engine running when he arrived, and he had grabbed a suitcase and pack bag and run for the plane without stopping to remove the hatchet. So it was still on his belt. At first, he had been embarrassed, but the pilot had said nothing about it, and Brian forgot it as they took off and began flying. More smell now. Bad. Brian turned again to glance at the pilot, who had both hands on his stomach and was grimacing in pain and reaching for the left shoulder again as Brian watched. Don't know, kid. The pilot's words were a hiss, barely audible. Bad aches here, bad aches. Thought it was something I ate, but he stopped as a fresh spasm of pain hit him. Even Brian could see how bad it was. The pain drove the pilot back into the seat and back down. I never had anything like this. The pilot reached for a switch on his mic cord, and his hand coming up in a small arc from his stomach, and he flipped the switch and said, "This is Flight 46, and now a jolt took him like a hammer blow, so forcefully that he seemed to crush back into the seat, and Brian reached for him and could not understand at first what it was and could not know. And then he knew. Brian knew. The pilot's mouth went rigid, and he swore, and he jerked a short series of slams into the seat, holding his shoulder now. Swore and hissed, "Chest! Oh, God, my chest is coming apart." Brian knew now. The pilot was having a heart attack. Brian had been in the shopping mall and with his mother when a man in the front of Paisley's store had suffered a heart attack. He had gone down and screamed about his chest, an old man, much older than the pilot. Brian knew. The pilot was having a heart attack. And even as the knowledge came to Brian, he saw the pilot slam into the seat one more time. One more awful time he slammed back into the seat, and his right leg jerked, pulling the plane to the side in a sudden twist, and his head fell forward, and spit came. Spit came from the corner of his mouth, and his legs contracted up into the seat, and his eyes rolled back in his head until there was only white. Only white for his eyes, and the smell became worse and filled the cockpit, and all of it so fast, so incredibly fast, that Brian's mind could not take it at first. He could only see it in stages. The pilot had been talking just a moment ago, complaining of the pain. He had been talking, and then the jolts had come. The jolts that took the pilot back had come, and now Brian sat, and there was a strange feeling of silence in the thrumming roar of the engine, a strange feeling of silence and being alone. Brian was stopped. He was stopped. Inside he was stopped. He could not think past what he saw and what he felt. All was stopped. The very core of him, the very center of Brian Robeson, was stopped and stricken with a white flash of horror. A terror so intense that his breathing, his thinking, and nearly his heart had stopped. Seconds passed, seconds that became all of his life, and he began to know what he was seeing, began to understand what he saw, and that was what was worse. And that was worse, so much worse, that he wanted to make his mind freeze again. He was sitting in a bush plane, roaring 7,000 feet above the northern wilderness, with a pilot who had suffered a massive heart attack and who was either dead or in something close to a coma. He was alone. In the roaring plane with no pilot, he was alone. Alone. Okay, Team Alabama, add to your facts. We need to get to 50, and we have a whole bunch of new things that we know right now. Also, you might want to ask him some questions. What's going to happen to Brian? Can he fly the plane? Ask yourself some questions and add those to your Google Doc. Have a great rest of your day, Team Alabama.